Good morning, everybody. And welcome. My name is Noel. I'm the director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts, and it's my great privilege and honor to welcome you here today to a full day of adventure on women's voices from American frontiers. This symposium is run in conjunction with an exhibition that's plastered all over the library called Okay, I'll Do It Myself, Narrative of Intrepid Women in the American Wilderness, which are selections from the Caroline F. Schimmel Collection. And Caroline is here today. Round of applause, please. So I first met Caroline in 2013. I was introduced by a mutual friend, a mutual Grolier Club member, a very generous donor to Penn, and someone from whom you should not order an Uber. And so I went to Greenwich to see Caroline, and that was the first time that I saw Calamity Jane's autobiography in a bank vault in Greenwich. And it's wonderful for me to see Calamity Jane on view here today. In the last 5 years, we at Penn Libraries and in the Kislak Center have got to know Caroline extremely well, and Regan Kladstrup has been the principal steward of our relationship with Caroline, which has truly blossomed, and as a result of this, Caroline has given her fiction collection to Penn. That's about 7,000 volumes of wonderful writers, including Zora Neale Hurston. I need to tell you that I have actually shaped Caroline's collection. Because when I met her, I said that an old flame of mine, called Susan Elderkin, had written a novel on a guy who lived in a caravan in New Mexico, and it was fiction. I didn't think much more of it, but when I then saw the collection here, not one, but two copies. There was the English version and the Spanish version of the said publication. So I am deeply invested in Caroline's collection. Regan has put together a show of highlights from this collection, a pop-up exhibit in the Lee Library, which is through there, and it's going to be open throughout all the breaks. So do please get the chance to see some of those books. It's a wonderful, wonderful selection of things. We've all got to know Caroline, and putting on an exhibition and a conference like this is a joint project. And Lynne, Farrington and John Pollock are primarily responsible for pulling together a phenomenal collection of people and topics and arranged it beautifully. Those that are speaking today have a lot to live up to after last night's wonderful lecture by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And so it's a great pleasure for me to now welcome Lynne to the podium to introduce the first session. Thank you. Lynne Farrington.
Thank you, Will. I must say that I'm thrilled to be here with you today for what I know will be a truly interdisciplinary experience with talks on literature, art, history, and more, all revolving around the theme of women's voices from American frontiers. Yesterday evening, for those of you who weren't here, we heard Laurel Thatcher Ulrich make connections among three apparently unconnected women in what Ulrich referred to as the creative chaos of Caroline's collection. The three women, Elizabeth Hansom, number 15 in the exhibition and the catalog, taken captivity by Indians and later ransomed by French Canadians. The naturalist and artist, Mary Sibylla Marion, number 62, who traveled to Suriname with her daughter, and the anti-polygamist Anne Eliza D. Webb Young, number 30, who was Brigham Young's wife, number 19. So you should, if you didn't have a chance to hear the talk, you should go over and check out those pieces, which are fascinating in themselves. I want to join Will in thanking all the speakers and colleagues who made this conference possible and acknowledge the many Penn faculty who made suggestions and connections as we were organizing this conference. It was invaluable what they were able to offer us. And I want to acknowledge the conference co-sponsors here at Penn, the Departments of English, History, and the History of Art, along with the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women. Many thanks to all of them. Before I introduce the first speaker, I too want to recognize two people without whom we wouldn't be here today. First, I want to thank my colleague Reagan Kladstrup for her incredible work shepherding Carolyn's amazing fiction collection through the doors and onto the shelves of the Penn libraries, where it is now being used by Penn students and faculty. Yay! And as you know, the pop-up exhibit from the collection, as Will mentioned, is over in the Lee Library, so you must go see it. Last, I want to recognize Carolyn for being an amazing and generous collector whose legacy to scholarship will not only be the books, manuscripts, photographs, and artifacts that she collected, but also the many monographs, articles, and talks that will be inspired by and written using her collection. So thank you, Carolyn, for doing that. Now I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker for our very first session, Revisiting Frontiers. David Wrobel is a historian of American thought and culture in the American West, who serves as Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oklahoma, where he is the David L. Boren Professor and Merrick Chair of Western American History. He is the author of numerous books, America's West, A History, 1980 to 19... I got the wrong years there. I just realized. 1890, I reverted them. 1890 to 1950, which was published in 2017. Global West, American Frontier, Travel, Empire, and Exceptionalism from Manifest Destiny to the Great Depression from 1913. That was winner of the Western Heritage Award for Western Nonfiction. Promised Lands, Promotion, Memory, and the Creation of the American West from 2002. And The End of American Exceptionalism, Frontier Anxiety from the Old West to the New Deal from 1993, which strikes me as maybe pertinent today as well as numerous articles and essays. He's currently working on John Steinbeck's America, 1930 to 1968, A Cultural History, and he also co-edits the Modern American West book series and serves on the editorial board for the Steinbeck Review. David's clearly extremely busy with his various deanship and writing duties, especially at this time of year. So we were so delighted that he could join us today to speak on the global West that woman made, learning from Ida Pfeiffer, Isabel Bird, and Mary Kingsley. Please join me in welcoming David Wrobel.
Morning, everybody. I'm honored to have been asked to participate in the Women's Voices from American Frontiers Symposium that marks the opening of Caroline's really fantastic exhibit. To be frank, I'm a little bit nervous too. The prospect of presenting to a group of experts in Western women's history, given my status as, at best, an occasional interloper in the field, it's the cause of a sort of frontier anxiety for me. Still, the prospect of a couple of days away from being dean and the chance to return to some old friends from the distant past and to make some new ones among this distinguished group. Because of that, I'm here and thrilled to be included. Also, in the interest of full transparency and yet nonetheless concerned about appearing too self-revelatory, I'll add that my mother raised my two elder brothers and me single-handedly in the southwest part of London. And after I drifted into the field of Western history, she began asking me to find her good books on Western women pioneers. She loves the Covered Wagon Women series, and perhaps I see something of my mother in the women I'm about to discuss today. I'll begin on the American Western frontier with the most memorable character of my book, Promised Lands. I'm not sure the book was particularly memorable, but certainly the indomitable Juliet Breyer is memorable. In April 1849, a group of 36 single young men left the town of Galesburg, Illinois, to cross the plains and claim their fortunes in gold in California. They named themselves the Jayhawkers of 49. In Salt Lake City, they joined a larger party of men, women, and children, and they hired a Mormon guide to lead them to the goldfields. However, the Jayhawkers were concerned that traveling with that larger group would be too slow for them to get rich quick. So with a few others, they separated from the main party, and they tried a shortcut by way of the Walker Pass, inadvisable. They became lost in Death Valley. There they suffered the ravages of hunger and thirst. 3 of them died, and when they finally emerged from Death Valley in February 1850, the Jayhawkers were described by observers as walking skeletons, the contours of their teeth clearly visible through the stretched skin and flesh of their gaunt, hollow cheeks. The party's youngest member, John Burt Colton, had reportedly weighed 160 pounds at the beginning of the trip and was said to have weighed 64 pounds at the end. So, 36 white American males who abandoned women and children in a race for gold. Hardly the stuff of Western frontier legend as traditionally conceived, and seemingly not particularly pertinent to our present proceedings. However, the most heroic of the Jayhawker party, though not actually a member of it, was Juliet Wells Breyer, the wife of the Reverend John Wells Breyer, who, with their 3 children, trailed behind the Jayhawkers all the way through Death Valley. Her husband, from all accounts, was absolutely useless. Juliet was the one who at times quite literally carried the children, aged 4, 7, and 9, Kirk, the eldest and weakest, on her back, John, the youngest, in her arms, and the memorably named Christopher Columbus she led by the hand. Juliet packed and unpacked the oxen each day, and she provided the necessary encouragement and support for her family, and to no small degree for the Jayhawkers too. One Jayhawker recalled, Mrs. Breyer did all sorts of work when the father of the family, which was too tired, which was almost all of the time, and concluded that she was by far the best man of the Breyer party. Charles Lummis, a chronicler, not a participant in the Jayhawker ordeal, described her as that wonderful little woman with magnificent pluck. The remarkable Juliet Breyer died in 1913, just a few months short of her 100th birthday. If ever there were a relatively little-known historical figure crying out for a full biography and accompanying movie, reach out to Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and maybe we could get it. When I arrived in Norman, Oklahoma in 2011, I wrote a foreword for the very slow-to-emerge paperback edition of the book Promised Lands, and I considered everything I would have included had I been writing it that year and not a decade earlier. I think a really good exercise I'd recommend to all of us in returning to our old books, doing so critically. And I'd left out Mormons for the most part, and that was an oversight, to be sure. It was the hole in the donut, as I was reminded, primarily by historians in Utah. But of even greater consequence, I'd left out the world, so the larger breakfast buffet that the donut itself was just a small part of. I'd written a whole book on how the West had been promoted by boosters and remembered by settlers, how those processes had helped create the actual West that people live in, as well as the West of our imagination, while naively assuming those processes were uniquely American and had shaped something distinctly Western American. Still, on the plus side, it was an oversight that quite soon after the original publication of that book led me to the topic of travel writing. Travel writing, as you know, was an incredibly popular and influential genre in the 19th and early 20th centuries, one that many readers relied on for their principal knowledge of faraway peoples and places. And the travel book endures, even thrives today, despite the many proclamations during the 20th century that new technological innovations, namely, or most notably, commercial airline travel, would kill it. Sitting in Yale's Beinecke Library in 2005 to 6 and working my way decade by decade through a century of works, or at least a sampling of the best of those works, that fall under the Library of Congress's West Travel Description subject category, I became increasingly aware that the American Western frontier of the 19th century was often in the minds and pages of travel writers, but one frontier in a much larger global landscape of discovery, development, empire, and colonization. Huge numbers of travel books recounted global journeys that included the American West. We do well to think of the 19th century American West as the global West, I think, and the 20th century West as a distinctly American frontier, a sort of inversion of the traditional narrative. Women travelers, I'd suggest, played a central role in making that global West. But one more important signpost before I introduce several women who made the global West. My book, Global West, American Frontier, offers a challenge to the prevailing scholarly consensus on travel writers. Travel writers, like the broader category of tourists, are commonly dismissed by scholars as commodifiers and objectifiers and exoticizers of the other. They are the irascible agents of empire who packaged the colonized peoples and places that constituted the fruits of Western empire for popular audiences, and even for power brokers themselves in the very seats of empire. These travel-writing agents of empire, the winds or the whims of scholarly consensus suggest, were not mere chroniclers of colonialism, but the conveyors and codifiers who facilitated the very consumption and digestion of those fruits of empire. Travel writers, in a nutshell, were the proverbial tail that wagged the dog of empire. That's the story that much of the scholarship in recent decades on travel writing tells. I look back on those pleasant yet confusing days a decade or so ago, reflecting on the Saïdian-inspired theories about travel writing and reading the travel accounts themselves in the Beinecke and Huntington libraries. And I wondered why so many of the most engaging travel writers of the 19th century didn't seem at all to be prophets of empire or perpetrators of an imperial gaze. And I concluded and remain convinced that the scholarly theory was simply misaligned with the historical record. In short, while some travel writers clearly encapsulated that post-colonial critique of the travel writing genre, others were among the most important critics of Western empire. They were, in fact, quite often the tail that wagged the dog of anti-imperialism. The global West that some women made included participation in the building and legitimizing of empires, yet other women travelers often provided the moral compasses that pointed to the awful consequences that accompany imperial projects. So, to the three travel writing women. In fall 1853, the Austrian traveler Ida Pfeiffer, then in her mid to late 50s, visited Oregon and the California goldfields in the course of a larger journey that also included the Malay Peninsula, Australia, and South America. Her popular account, A Lady's Second Journey Round the World, published in 1856, is an important example of travel writers' emphasis on and American and Western European public exposure to the human suffering that accompanied colonization in the far West. Pfeiffer examined the plight of California Indians around Marysville, noting that the Indians who live in the neighborhood of the whites are said to die off much more rapidly than those who've taken refuge in the interior of the forests. She pointed to the deadly impact of spirituous liquors and smallpox, but Pfeiffer was more explicit in her accounting of the factors behind Indian population decline among the Rogue River Indians of present-day Southwest Oregon, whom she visited 2 years prior to the outbreak of the Rogue River Wars of 1855 to 56. She commented on how these Indians are represented as treacherous, cowardly, and revengeful, and only attacking the whites when they found one alone. But then Pfeiffer charged that if the whites had suffered as many wrongs from them as they do from the whites, I think they too would have felt the desire of revenge. Pfeiffer observed several burnt and devastated wigwams, whence the people had been driven out by force because they would not willingly give up their native soil to the stranger. And she further commented on the seduction and often simply seizure and rape of Indian women, and criticized the government for its overindulgence towards the white settlers, noting that until there was a judicial system in place to severely punish the perpetrators for their actions, the poor Indian will remain the sport of the insolent white. A generation later, in 1873, the Englishwoman Isabella Bird wrote a series of letters home to her sister Henrietta in England, a series of letters about her travels in Colorado. And the resulting book, A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, was published in London and New York in 1879, was in its 7th edition by 1882, and remains in print today. Born in 1831, Isabella was described by an acquaintance as buck-toothed, stout, sickly, and short, 4 feet 11 inches tall. Earlier in her life, Bird's doctors determined that her head was too large for her frame and advised her to avoid holding it up. Her family thought of her as an invalid, apt to die young. Yet Bird's descriptions in A Lady's Life of her ascent of the 14,700-foot Long's Peak in October 1873, with the assistance of the archetypal Western desperado One-Eyed Mountain Jim, and her winter horseback rides across the Colorado Plains and Rockies, suggest a conquering of physical frailty that more than rivals the better-known story of Theodore Roosevelt's celebrated transformation into muscular manhood. Bird's ascent of Long's Peak, it's important to remember, wasn't a typical accomplishment of the period, whether for women or men. On the mountain, she found a pair of overshoes, which she surmised were probably left by the Hayden exploring expedition a few years earlier. And that may well have been the case, since very few non-native people had ascended Long's Peak before Isabella Bird. For historians of the American West, Bird's story generally ends there in Colorado. But Bird went on to become a famous world traveler who climbed mountains, rode across deserts, and wrote book-length accounts, 9 altogether, of her adventures in Japan, Malaysia, Persia and Kurdistan, Tibet, Korea, and China, as well as the Hawaiian Islands and Colorado. Western historians have paid little attention to Bird's global travels, which is unfortunate because some of the same topics she addressed in the Western Rockies are evident in those later accounts of travel in the Near and Far East. Indeed, Bird's worldview was shaped in part by her time in the American West. 5 years after she left the Rockies, Bird was in Japan and was driven by an impulse to get away from the major cities and treaty ports that most foreign visitors frequented and explore what she called the unbeaten tracks and savage wilds of the region. And in Unbeaten Tracks in Japan, she discussed her journey to the island of Hokkaido to spend time with the Aino people, the original inhabitants of the Japanese islands. She offered a thoroughly dismissive and racist assessment of the Aino that paralleled her comments on California's Digger Indians. In A Lady's Life, she described the Digger Indians as perfect savages, without any aptitude for even Aboriginal civilization, altogether the most degraded of the ill-fated tribes which are dying out before the white races. And in similarly condemnatory fashion, she assessed the savage life of the Aino as one not much raised above the necessities of animal existence, timid, monotonous, barren of good, dark, dull, though at its lowest and worst, considerably higher than that of many other Aboriginal races. A faint praise indeed. A few months after her Japan trip, Bird was traveling across the Malay Peninsula, where no European steamers had landed, a place generally believed to be a vast and malarious equatorial jungle. And in the resulting 1883 book, The Golden Chersonese, Bird commented on indigenous population decline in the region, offering the damning observation, if they were swept away tomorrow, not a trace of them except their metalwork would be found. Civilized as they are, they don't leave any more impress on the country than a red Indian would. Bird placed the demographic collapse of American Indians into a global context, and in doing so, offered validation for the expansion of imperial systems. In 1891, Bird rode across Persia and Kurdistan. Then in her late 60s, she undertook another horseback trip from Tangier, 1,000 miles across Morocco to the Atlas Mountains. She fell ill after returning to England and died in 1904, just short of her 73rd birthday. Her adventurous life of travel and her chronicles of those journeys serve as a good example of how Western American experiences could shape the experience of world travel, just as global travels could shape perceptions of the West. Bird placed the West firmly into the 19th century world of empire. So Bird and Pfeiffer are just two of the hundreds of 19th century global travelers. We could also include George Catlin, Friedrich Gerstacker, Francis Burton, Robert Louis Stevenson, Mark Twain, all of whom placed the drama of the West on a global stage, reminding Americans that they were a principal part of the world of empire building, not an exception to it. In 1866, when the first successful transatlantic cable was put into service, and even more so in 1869 with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the nation became more firmly connected to that wider world. Indeed, the railroad closed the final link in a global transportation chain. It was now possible to travel all the way around the world on trains and ships. Jules Verne referenced the transatlantic cable in his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1869, and a few years later in his Around the World in 80 Days. In that work, a few years later, Around the World in 80 Days appeared, and in that work, chief protagonist Phileas Fogg travels to Bombay, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Yokohama, and Shanghai, then on to San Francisco, across the United States, 3-hour delay on the Central Pacific Railroad in the Humboldt Range, courtesy of a lumbering herd of bison, thrilling ride on a sail-powered sled from Fort Kearny to Omaha, Nebraska, on to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, and down to London, arriving just in time to win his bet. The previous year, 1872, British tour operator Thomas Cook, the father of modern mass tourism, led his first personally conducted 220-day world tour. And as this audience knows better than perhaps any other, in 1889, the American journalist and travel writer Nellie Bly completed a much publicized trip around the world in just 72 days following the Cook-Fogg route. And that route became the standard for world travelers in the 19th century. These images are from the display case on the first floor of the library with the amazing Nellie Bly board game, which I'd never seen before. Cook's itinerary actually created a travel infrastructure that in turn helped birth a new mountain of travel books in the late 19th century. And as that century drew to a close, British traveler Mary Henrietta Kingsley published Travels in West Africa, that was in 1897, and West African Studies in 1899. In the first study, recounting her time in the region in 1893 and 1894 and 95, she criticized British missionary efforts for their insensitivity to the continent's cultures, and she derided their dedication to ensuring that readers of missionary reports and financial contributors to the cause would not, as she said, get any foolishness into their heads about obtaining an inadequate supply of souls for their money. She also offered ardent and convincing defenses of indigenous cultural practices, including polygamy. In the midst of the ensuing controversy, Kingsley wrote to renowned Oxford anthropologist E.B. Taylor, championing the benefits of actually living among the people who one wrote about, rather than relying on the misassumptions and stereotypes about Africans perpetuated in the popular press and by politicians. She caustically referred to missionaries, stockbrokers, good intentions, ignorance, and Maxim guns as the old toys of British empire building. Then in West African Studies, which included coverage of her time among the Fang people, purported cannibals, Kingsley referred to the maladministration of West Africa as a disgrace to my country. She added that we have killed down native races in Australasia and America, and it is no use slurring over the fact that we have profited by doing so. And she warned that the pattern ought not to be repeated on another continent. Kingsley, to be clear, was not a thoroughgoing critic of British Empire, but rather of the policies and practices used to establish and govern it. She favored an informal imperialism based on commerce, but nonetheless, her effectiveness in illuminating the essential humanity of Africans and the complexity and variety of their cultural systems certainly cut against the grain of official pro-empire attitudes in British government and press, which held that the peoples of darkest Africa were barbarous and much in need of a firm, white, civilizing hand. And interestingly, Kingsley's empathetic treatment of African societies and her emphasis on colonial Britain's misguided policies may well have resulted from the influence of her father, Dr. Charles George Kingsley, a personal physician to several British aristocrats and ardent critic of US Indian policy. Charles Kingsley had accompanied Lord Dunraven on his travels to North America in the first half of the 1870s, and had been invited to join George Armstrong Custer on his fateful trip into the Montana Territory in the early summer of 1876, but bad weather proved his good fortune by preventing him from doing so. Mary, though, would die in a war zone in 1900, aged 37, after contracting typhoid fever while working for the British government nursing Boer prisoners of war in South Africa. Before her fateful end, though, Kingsley met the champion of the white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling, in South Africa, and she offered a public response to his rhetoric concerning the responsibilities of empire for superior peoples. Kingsley proclaimed, "It's the black man's burden that wants singing, for the poor African has to put up with a lot of windy-headed fads and foolishness, no good to him or the white man, and a jest for the gods." Mary Kingsley's life highlights the anti-imperialistic strain in travel writings that appeared as European powers and the United States were racing to acquire colonial possessions across the globe. Between 1876 and 1915, these countries gained an additional quarter of the world's landmass. The likely influence of father on daughter, of the brutal subjugation of native peoples in the US West as an object lesson for the British in how not to manage empire and treat subject peoples in Africa, serves as another example of the American West's place in the wider world and of the role intrepid women played in making that global West. Thanks very much for listening to these stories.
Our second speaker is Ellen Handy, an associate professor at the City College of New York, where she teaches the history of photography and American art. She's an art historian, critic, and curator, and was formerly the executive curator of visual collections at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Austin. And before that, curator of collections at the International Center for Photography. More recently, she's had a number of fellowships, and she is currently writing a new general history of the photographic medium called Histories of Photography, as well as an article about Doris Ullman and soft-focus ethnographic photography. I heard Ellen speak last fall at the Bibliography Across the Disciplines Conference, hosted by the Rare Book School and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and I so enjoyed her talk on the art of ethnography and photogravure, reading Julia Peterkin and Doris Ullman's Jordan role in material terms, that I immediately thought of her work when considering who we might invite to give a paper at this conference. Today, she will explore the conference theme with Where Does the Frontier Begin? Doris Ullman and Julia Peterkin's Jordan Roll, number 90 in the exhibit and the catalog. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Handy.
Okay, thank you for the help, and thank you, Lynne. I'm delighted to be here in this great library on the occasion of this great exhibition. I think my talk might have the broadest title of any to be given today, Where Does the Frontier Begin? But in fact, my subject is probably amongst the most narrow. This book, produced in collaboration by these two women, Doris Ullman, the photographer, and Julia Peterkin, the writer. This portrait captures their friendship at the outset of their partnership, when at its closest. Their book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, was published in trade and deluxe editions in 1933, the covers of which you see here. It portrayed the lives of African Americans in coastal South Carolina, specifically the descendants of slaves living and working on Peterkin family's plantation, Lang Syne. They spoke a dialect closely related to African languages. Raised by a Gullah-speaking nursemaid, Peterkin was herself a native speaker. In considering Roll, Jordan, Roll today, a larger question arises. Where does the frontier begin? How far did this book's authors go to find their frontiers? Here you see views of Peterkin's and Ullman's homes, neither apparently proximate to what we usually think of as literal wilderness. This is the location of Lang Syne Plantation, only about 40 miles from South Carolina's capital, Columbia, but located in a region still extremely rural and culturally distinct from the city in the 1930s. If the frontier is a liminal zone that marks the beginning of the wild unknown, the space necessary for working out questions of self, then Peterkin and Ullman's collaboration operated near wilderness, And certainly their subjects lived more than Caroline's statutory 50 yards from a flush toilet. By the 1930s, the American South was long settled, but for a white Northern observer, going south involved crossing a frontier, and for a white plantation owner, exploring the subjectivities of Black plantation workers was a stark transgression of local mores. The frontier that lay between both women and their subjects was that of race. What were Ullman and Peterkin seeking on the frontiers of race? Peterkin claimed freedoms of expression and experience by writing about the lives of her employees, and Ullman found it easier to be at home in someone else's world than her own. How did their contributions to the book offer different emphases? The house at Laegreid Plantation was built in 1915 after an earlier structure was destroyed by fire. Julia Peterkin presided over this up-to-date, relatively modest home and helped her husband to introduce agricultural innovations. But over time, she embraced and repudiated the conventions of the chatelaine of the plantation. Fascinated by the lives of the workers at Laegreid, she began her career as a writer by appropriating and transcribing their stories, fiction based in fact. This met with critical praise in the North, including endorsement by the NAACP and a Pulitzer Prize in 1929 for the novel Scarlet Sister Mary. But Peterkin's engagement with African American subject matter alarmed her family and white neighbors. Today, many scholars and critics find her writing to be cultural appropriation, but in her day, it was breathtakingly progressive. In 1922, Peterkin wrote to H.L. Mencken that these Black friends of mine live more in one Saturday night than I do in 5 years. I envy them, and as I guess I cannot be them, I seek satisfaction in trying to record them. But the revanchist claims of the Old South upon Peterkin had begun to reassert themselves by 1933, when the first line of text for Roll Jordan Roll read, "Some of the charm that made the life of the Old South glamorous still lingers on a few plantations that have been so cut off from the outside world by rivers, wide swamps, and lack of roads that they are still undisturbed by the restless present." It's notable that no plate accompanied these words. Ullman's response to the experience of Black workers in the modern South did not include nostalgia. Although Peterkin provided her with entree to the world of Laegreid, Ullman insisted upon inviting her subjects to present themselves as they wished, resulting in images often at odds with Peterkin's text. Martha Gruning, writing in the NAACP's magazine The Crisis in 1934, praised Ullman's image's sensitivity while noting that too often the complacency of the white big house owner gets the better of Mrs. Peterkin's native gifts of clear-sightedness and irony. Ullman was a New Yorker, ethnically Jewish but active in the secular humanist ethical culture movement. From an affluent family and divorced early from a physician husband, she lived on Park Avenue, pursuing portrait photography as art and avocation rather than profession. When she traveled south to explore with her camera, she was driven by her chauffeur in a luxurious automobile. Ullman visited Laegreid to photograph in 1929 and 30. Her first books were albums of portraits of the medical faculties of Johns Hopkins and Columbia Universities, followed by one dedicated to book and magazine editors. What's most notable is how similar her approach is for bourgeois professionals and for the people at Lang Syne, offering all subjects the opportunity to project themselves into the pictorial space of the portraits she was making. Ullman's book's designs show her embrace of the American arts and crafts movement and her close ties to renowned typographers and printers Frederick and Bertha Gowdy, who were her friends as well as collaborators. Her work was a late occurring example of the pictorialist style, which sought to promote photography as fine art and win parity for it amongst the other arts. Pictorialism's rejection of the applied documentary functions of the medium was embodied in its soft focus, a stylistic attribute which paired well with photogravure and accentuated the medium's resemblance to the other graphic arts. But Ullman sought to apply pictorialist aesthetics to an ethnographic survey of rural Southern life, making portraits which were both documents and fine art. The limited edition of Roll Jordan Roll included 90 richly printed photogravure plates, while the trade edition had 76 offset printed illustrations. The limited edition's handsome plain binding and cover, embossed with the profile of a woman, more closely resemble Ullman's previous books than Peterkin's, while the cover of the trade edition is quite similar to those of Peterkin's books. And it's wonderful to be able to see these two books side by side here in this exhibition on the first floor. So please, please look for them if you haven't seen them yet. On the title page, Ullman's images are identified as studies rather than as illustrations, which suggests their autonomy. By the beginning of the 20th century, photogravure was associated with artistically ambitious illustrated books. It translates photographic positives to etched metal plates, which print the images in ink with a press. Although photogravure could be considered as a means of reproduction, it is usually presented as a fine art print medium in its own right, unlike the industrial production of offset printing. The offset printing of the trade edition of Roll Jordan Roll was barely serviceable in conveying Ullman's images. Indeed, Dorothy Van Doren's review complained that many of the pictures are so soft and vague as to be mere black blobs. The offset illustration's inferiority to the limited edition's photogravure plates is evident in these details. The choice of photogravure for the book's limited edition required that the images be printed on thick paper with defining plate marks evident, both recto and verso on the sheets, whereas in the trade edition, other images were usually printed on the versos of each plate. The New York Times characterized Roll Jordan Roll as a collaboration of two mediums, but it's more accurate to describe the two editions as embodying different outcomes in a battle for primacy between image and text, and between the very different points of view of collaborators. If you read the text, then look at the adjacent photographs, it's clear that they aren't illustrations, since they may not even be related in subject. But if you look first at the gravures, they are complete in themselves and don't really demand recourse to the texts. As a reviewer noted, it is not always easy to determine the relation between the picture and the printed page, and perhaps, in some cases, no connection is intended to be implied. Peterkin recounted the social and sexual adventures of her subjects as they unfolded over lifetimes, while Ullman's subject was always a single moment of encounter between her camera and the selves her sitters chose to present. Both women were acutely aware of lived experience beyond their own, but this interested Ullmann in relation to other people, while Peterkin sought in it vicarious expression of her own emotions and experiences. Ullmann's observation and Peterkin's ventriloquism, Peterkin's embeddedness in the place whose culture she chronicled, and Ullmann's status as an outsider become entwined in this collaboration, providing both difficulty and opportunity for each party. Ullmann's formal and material choices signaled the presence of a photographer framing the images, but within that frame, her subjects were offered freedom to present themselves as they wished, while Peterkin's fictionalization and narration of the stories of her subjects made those choices for them, often at their expense. Whereas Ullmann's image concentrates on the figure against the sky, the ox cart driver as man the measure of all things, Peterkin's text rambles through a range of generalizations and condescension. She wrote, "Instead of striving to move about swiftly and multiply experience, they are contented to travel their crooked paths and rough roads on foot or in mule-drawn wagons or ox carts. The most immediate desires of these simple people are concerned with acquiring clothes to wear on important occasions, owning a possum or coon dog, a gun, a horse and buggy. Instead of spending their strength in striving to reach some fixed goal, they live from day to day, for they know they are moving along a road which leads all living things to that last goal, which is forever hidden from mortal eyes." Ullmann's images observe individuals pausing to pose in a particular and immediate moment of their lives. Peterkin's texts relate the present to the past, sometimes implausibly. When Peterkin wrote, "The hardships of slavery have faded from their memories, and they often express a wish for its advantages," this can't be seen in Ullmann's photographs. Del Warren recounted an anecdote about one of Ullmann's sitters in South Carolina who adopted a very formal pose, and when Ullmann invited her to move around and talk, demurred, saying, "I will not talk and I will not move. Something tells me to be quiet. This is God's work." The title of this book announces spirituality as its central theme, a claim fulfilled more by Ullmann's photographs than Peterkin's narrative. These views of a foot-washing ceremony and a river baptism depict God's work in a literal sense. Peterkin presented the religious life of this community in secular and material terms, calling Sunday a day of pleasure when Christians and sinners dress up in their best clothes, whether they expect to go to church or not. Church attendance is always large, for the religious services gratify an innate need for emotional release and also satisfy social cravings and love of excitement. As this historic marker indicates, African American identity and community were bound up with this church from the time of slavery onward, and love of excitement hardly explains that importance. In Ullmann's images, the spiritual is coterminous with the social, and religion and work are both pillars of identity and community. Arduous stoop labor is clearly described in Ullmann's photographs, making it evident that agriculture is work. Whereas Peterkin's text about cotton characteristically leapt from the workers' long hours in the field to emphasize their future pleasure in later spending the money so earned. Peterkin used the asparagus harvest as the occasion for a tale of love and betrayal among the workers, but Ullman faithfully observed grading, packaging, and marketing of this cash crop, recently introduced to Lang Syn's traditional cotton-based economy. Here we see the toughness and accuracy of Ullman's rendering of race and power relations, which in no way correspond to Peterkin's complicated ambivalence about the interdependence of blacks and whites at Lang Syne. Despite the radiance of the gravures, they are unsparing in their depiction of the conditions of working life for African Americans in the Deep South 60 years after the end of slavery. Martha Gruning quoted Peterkin's painfully inaccurate description of laboring convicts singing cheerfully, then responded, "But the 3 cruel, insistent photographs taken by Doris Ullman do not show singing or cheerful men. There is an almost grotesque discrepancy, in fact, between Mrs. Peterkin's babblings on the subject of the cheerful Negro songsters and the bitter sense of injustice plainly felt by the morose men in these grim photographs." Ullman's collaboration with her subjects reflects the secular humanism of the Ethical Culture Society, under whose auspices she'd studied. Its founder, Felix Adler, wrote that, "If we could see holiness, beauty, concealed within our fellow beings, we should be drawn towards them by the most powerful attraction, willingly living in their life and permitting them to live in ours." Although Caroline Schimmel's collection is focused upon women in the wilderness, in a curious way, her copy of the trade edition of Roll Jordan Roll actually removes itself from the realm of wilderness and brings it into the intimate heart of a known, settled, familiar world through inscriptions in its pages identifying some of the sitters by name. Ullman's photographs were all untitled, and Peterkin invented pseudonyms for characters, some of whom were probably composites. But an unknown owner of this volume was able to name Uncle Moses Duncan, whom you see here. Once named, he transforms the book from literary reverie or ethnographic description to a document of family genealogy. Reading the inscriptions upon and subject matter of these images is easy. Reading their form and style and materiality is harder, as is resolving the apparent contradictions in the book's 2 authors' responses to their subjects. But the thickness of the pages on which the luminous gravures are printed, the soft focus of the images, the elegantly understated book design, and measured grace of portrait compositions, their materiality and that of the volume itself are rhetorical strategies calling attention to the presence of the photographer in attentive partnership with her subjects. In a sense, Ullman's aestheticized ethnography erases frontiers between a wilderness of subject matter and her own metropolitan artistic practice. The wilderness Peterkin explored was within herself, projected upon her African American subjects, while Ullman invited them to approach her across those frontiers as they pleased. The wilderness she explored was that of the world at large. Thank you.
In the back. Start back here.
Hi, I actually have 2 questions. I wondered if there was any effort by Ullman to give prints of the portraits to the subjects. And I wondered also if you could put this work of Ullman's in context with some of the WPA grants that were given to, say, Bernice Abbott and others in the 30s?
Those are great questions. I don't know of any documented gift of prints from Ullman to the sitters in Jordan Roll, but I suspect they occurred because in other instances we know very well that she took great pains to give copies of portraits to her subjects, and I'm assuming by extension that it happened also at Lang Syne Plantation. And in terms of government-sponsored documentary surveys of the 30s, a really interesting parallel with Doris Ullman's work is that of Dorothea Lange, who made probably the most famous single photograph of the 30s, the migrant mother image that was on a postage stamp and is endlessly reproduced. Lange and Ullman both studied at the same school. They were both pupils of Clarence White, and they took very different paths, Lange establishing herself as a documenter, working in sharp focus, making images that were meant to be the national record, whereas Ullman insisted upon a more old-fashioned, a more luxurious, a more fine art presentation of her work, but shared a sense that in the rural people of the American South was something very important that needed to be understood and recognized as heritage. So I think for us here today, the West may be more important than the South, but the South is a very important place and represents a frontier for a lot of northeastern or middle Atlantic voyagers.
Can I just add really quickly, one more connection is that Florence Owens Thompson, the migrant mother, who was the sort of iconographic face of white American poverty, we learned in the late 1970s was a Cherokee woman.
It was an excellent presentation. Each of them was excellent in its way. I'm very interested in Ullman's work. How did she ever hook up, as they say, with that writer? And of course, it wouldn't. Now we can look back and say, "Oh, look at that condescending language and so forth." That may not have seemed that way at the time. I mean, I was in the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi in 1960, and people were saying things like, "These people, they're so happy to have us here among them." Well, it wasn't untrue because we were civil rights workers. On the other hand, it was fraught. And so, I mean, there was not much insight for a long, long time. So how did those two gals hook up, as it were, that early on?
They met in New York at a fashionable party, and I love the portrait of them both looking like glamorous urban women, which they were. And they were sophisticates, and Ullman was interested in cultural personalities and celebrities, and Peterkin was a Pulitzer Prize winner. You can't have a higher distinction in this country. So the project speaks about a rural South, but the genesis of it is possibly in Ullman's Park Avenue living room or a New York salon. And I think what you're saying about the complicated mixture of sentiment and condescension and goodwill and the difficulty of crossing boundaries is always true. It was in the 30s, it was during the Civil Rights Movement, it is today in the age of the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle for people to make common cause across differences of experience in all areas.
David, congratulations. This is exactly why I collect as wide as I can to pluck from what is perceived as one kind of literature and make it into documentation of another is, it's a skill. And it was wonderful. I just become even more guilty about having so few Native Americans in my collection. And I've figured out another workaround, which is I'm collecting the narratives of the first explorers in the Arctic And hello, they went to the Arctic. There were people there, including women. And it is the only mention of these people. So I've sort of dropped my barrier to having men in my collection because I'm finding out about how they sheltered the explorers and saved their lives and showed them how to live. And this is, another narrative throughout the exhibition and the collection. But, if you're a historian, you got to do what you got to do to find any trace at all. So that's wonderful. And yours was great.
Want to do one more?
Yeah, I'll ask something. Actually, thank you both so much. And maybe these are just some comments I could sort of put on the table for the rest of the day. The power of images. Ellen's talk, obviously, all about that, but there's an enormous amount of image work in David's material as well, and I would be interested in, at least the start of a dialogue about the power, but also the problem of images, the challenge of reading, essentially, which leads me to a second large question of the difficulty of finding critique, especially when it comes in reading images. Obviously, when you finally gave us that crisis review, it's spectacular because you have a sense there of what you're trying to get at in terms of a sort of one set of early responses. I wonder, of course, if other readers saw nothing of that contrast or problem that you identify in the text versus image. Other readers might not have seen it at all. And similarly, in David's series of case studies, there's always this problem, right? How do we know, where's the line of critique for its readers in some of those, what you want to characterize as anti-imperialist or challenge to an imperial case? So those are some big issues that perhaps we can.
Always taking the easy way out. I know we could do a much better job of answering questions about images. Some of the images that I included were images that had not been available just 5 years ago when the book, when Global West American Frontier went to press. I hadn't previously seen the image of Ida Pfeiffer playing piano prior to a couple of evenings ago. Similarly, the image of Mary Kingsley with two African male companions with a gorilla about to attack them, I had seen before, but had never, I'd purposely not included in the book out of concern that was a, sort of culturally appropriative sort of image and a problematic image. She also looks like she's about to pull some pepper spray out of her bag and spray the gorilla. I don't quite know what to make of that, but those are not images in the books. They're images that are generated around those narratives, sort of part maybe of the promotional campaigns for the book. So sometimes what those travel writers are trying to convey and what is actually conveyed about them are very much at odds.
Just a thought about critique. I was so struck while I was listening to David with the range of points of view of the subjects of which we speak. The women you were talking about who might be more or less on the same page with today's values or the values of many of us in this room. This is what makes it interesting. There's the critique of those historical writers, actors, image makers. There's our critique. There's the critique of the audiences of those women, and it gets very complicated surfing the waves of intersecting values. And I think the only way to make sense of that is to speak very plainly. And I thought it was so helpful when you told us the less than admirable views of some of the admirable women you were speaking about. That's how it is.
Last question.
I'm wondering with Miss Ullman, how do we know when you said she gave her, let her sitters have the freedom to express themselves? Did she say to them, all right, sit there, I'm going to do that? Or she didn't say, turn your head this way or look complacent. How did she do that without directing them?
Thank you for asking that. I cut, for lack of time, a quote from one of the sitters for an earlier project of hers, one of the magazine editors she photographed, who wrote at length about what the experience was of being photographed by Doris Ullman. And when people came to her home, she'd fuss over them and offer them drinks, and she had cigarettes available on her coffee table for smokers to choose from. And she'd busy herself in a kind of social interaction, putting her subjects at ease and just waiting for them to hit a point of comfort. And all of the people who were photographed by her describe this sort of long process of chatting and waiting and pausing. And to my eye, the photographs she made in the rural South look exactly like those she made on Park Avenue in terms of subjects assuming poses that look characteristic to them rather than characteristic to Doris Ullman. Thank you so much. I want to thank you.
Welcome. I'm very pleased to announce and tell you a bit about the speakers for this session. First, we'll hear from Melissa Homestead, who received her PhD in English from Penn in 1998, and that was one of the first graduate students I worked with here, so it's delightful to have her back. She's professor of English and program faculty in Women and Gender Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She specializes in American women's writing from the early Republic through the early 20th century, with a focus on authorship, publishing history, and the novel. Supported by an NEH fellowship, she will be spending this academic year completing the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, which is under contract with Oxford University Press. So we'll be getting at least a taste of that research today. Her talk today is Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, Plain Cowboy in the American Southwest.
So, as Nancy just mentioned, this presentation is drawn from my book In Progress about the personal and creative relationship between novelist Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, a magazine editor and advertising copywriter with whom Cather shared a home in New York City for 38 years. In that larger project, I recover Lewis both as Cather's domestic partner and her editorial collaborator. Oops, is that going to work? Arrow? No. Other way? No, the arrows are not working, so I do this one? Okay, let's do that way. Just right to go. Right, okay. Okay, I recover both as Cather's domestic partner and as her editorial collaborator. Notably, The Professor's House is the earliest Cather novel for which a working typescript survives, and Lewis's handwriting is all over it. My focus today is on their shared Southwestern travels that generated the middle section of the novel, Tom Outland's story, and on the relationship of their travel to the genre of the popular Western. As a feminist literary historian, I wish I could tell you that women's works about the Western wilds, recently recovered by, say, Nina Boehm or Victoria Lamont, inspired them, but alas, no. Instead, climbing around cliff dweller ruins at Mesa Verde and riding horses through the sagebrush in northern New Mexico, they were playing cowboy in the mold of the masculine popular Western tradition, with a little gender play from a high culture opera thrown in for good measure. When Cather and Lewis first traveled together to the Southwest in 1915, Cather had left magazine editing to write full-time, while Lewis was managing editor of a new cheap weekly, Every Week magazine. The dry heat and cool nights of the Southwest contrasted pleasantly with the humid heat of Manhattan, and Lewis needed a break from office stress. They were not the only enervated Eastern city dwellers to seek adventure and regeneration in the West. In 1885, Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, a nervous disease specialist, sent Owen Wister to a Montana cattle ranch to recover his shattered nerves. Wister's experiences inspired his much imitated Western, The Virginian. I never thought I would write a word about this novel, and Nancy forgot that she had assigned it in a grad seminar 24 years ago, but it's recently come back into my consciousness. Dr. Mitchell didn't send Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who had recently given birth out west. Instead, he sent her to bed for a rest cure, inspiring her story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in which this cure drives the narrator into madness. But when Catherine Lewis traveled to the Southwest, their choices of dress and activities indicate that they were playing cowboy in the fashion of the Virginian rather than being confined as women. Western Nebraska had once been cowboy territory, but when each lived in the state in the late 19th century, the farmer, not the cowman, predominated. To play cowboy, they needed to go further west to the southwestern desert, a landscape evoking Zane Grey's spectacularly successful Riders of the Purple Sage, in which the two heroes rescue two damsels from the Mormons and rustlers in the Utah desert. Grey set his novel in 1871. Of course, the open range cow, period was very short. And as Wister observed in his 1885 essay, The Evolution of the Cowpuncher, the true cowpuncher was now departed, never to return. Wister noted, however, one exception. New Mexico was the cowpuncher's last domain. Reading the proofs of the Song of the Lark with Cather in May and June whetted Lewis's appetite for her first trip to the Southwest. Cather's 1912 trip to Arizona's Walnut Canyon inspired a section of the Song of the Lark. In late June, Cather boasted that she would be going to the Big Cliff ruins down at Durango, Colorado late this summer. In late June, she was crowing to her friend Elizabeth Sargent about her new khakis for the cliff dwellers, just like Kurt's in Fidelio. The Wagnerian soprano Melanie Kurt had recently performed in Beethoven's only opera at the Met, and Cather's reference suggests that she and Lewis were self-consciously purchasing costumes for an adventure. Kurt performed the role of Lenore, wife of Spanish nobleman Florestan, who disguises herself as a young man, Fidelio, to rescue him from political imprisonment. In the second act, Lenore successfully rescues and is reunited with Florestan, but in the first, Fidelio is the love object of a woman, Marceline. This vocally and physically demanding role, lots of high notes and lots of stage action in trousers, and sopranos who sang it found themselves the object of special attention from lesbian opera fans. As Fidelio, Melanie Kurt wore dark velvet trousers tucked into knee-high boots and a matching jacket with blouse and tie underneath. Catherine Lewis's khaki suits differed from Kurt's stage costume only in texture and color. The female protagonists in Riders of the Purple Sage also don male attire. Jane Witherstein for practical reasons, but non-rustlers believe that the mysterious masked rider is a fearsome man. She's actually a young woman being held captive by the lead rustler, Oldring, whom she believes to be her father. I just read this novel recently, and it's insane. So anybody wants a... All right. As an adolescent, Cather sported a crew cut and called herself William, but she grew her hair out in college and adopted conventional women's attire. And in 1912, she wore a pleated skirt to Walnut Canyon with her brother Douglas. In 1915, before the 1920s revolution in women's fashion, women's fashion, wearing trousers was itself an adventure for the middle-aged Cather and Lewis. In early August, Cather and Lewis headed west by train. 4 decades later, in Willa Cather Living, her memoir about Cather, Lewis described this trip as purely for pleasure. Quote, "She loved the Southwest for its own sake. She did not go there with any express purpose for writing about it, of gathering material for a story." In August 1915, sitting in an elegant drawing room at the Brown Palace Hotel, this is an interview I recently found. It'll be published in Legacy soon. Cather frankly admitted to a young reporter for the Denver Times that she was going near Durango to see the old homes of the cliff dwellers, which she plans to use in her next novel. As they were single-mindedly pursuing literary material, Cather and Lewis merely stopped in Denver and took the most direct route there from southeastern Colorado, arriving in Mancos 2 days later, where Mesa Verde, their primary object, loomed in the near distance. They spent at least 2 days in the town making travel arrangements and quizzing locals about the national park. In 1914, automobiles had begun traveling the recently constructed road into the park, but Cather and Lewis were in pursuit of a 19th century experience, the 1888 discovery of the Cliff Palace ruins by Richard Wetherill, the son of a local ranching family. So they hired a team of horses and a driver to take them in. From their tent camp, this is a recent photograph, so I've been footstepping them. From their tent camp provided by visitors, the two women could see Balcony House, one of the smaller excavated ruins across Spruce Canyon. The married daughter of the park superintendent ran the camp, and her husband, Fred Jeep, served as Catherine Lewis's guide for a week of hiking and climbing to visit ruins. Modern visitors enter cliff ruins from the top of the mesa using ladders and paved paths. But in 1915, visitors had to either climb up from the canyon bottom or descend from the mesa top, using the hand and footholds carved into the rock by the cliff dwellers. In Riders of the Purple Sage, in Surprise Valley, one of the male protagonist's Venters comes across, quote, several little nicks and cuts in the solid stone, which he knows had been cut there by hand, and through age worn, he recognized them as steps cut into the rocks by the cliff dwellers. Later, he and the unmasked masked rider, Bess, climb together into the ruins. Bess continues to wear the dress of the male rider, boots of soft fine leather reaching clear to her knees, under in which she wore heavy woolen rider stockings half length, pulled up over the ends of her short trousers. Female visitors to Mesa Verde could borrow divided skirts, but Catherine Lewis had no need of this service. Lewis photographed a smiling Cather climbing the cliff face in her khaki adventure suits, her trousers tucked into her boots. This photograph is very newly in the Charles Cather collection at the University of Nebraska. When I found it a few weeks ago, I screamed. So anyway, Lewis recalled spending a whole day at the Cliff Palace ruin, the cliff dwelling described in Tom Outland, as she says in her memoir, part of the professor's house, cooking our lunch there and drinking from the spring behind the cliff houses. Like many tourists, they handed a camera back and forth between them. In their matching khaki suits, each posed on the same wall. Only Lewis's more slender build and their hats differentiate them. Cather's hat, indeed, is a cowboy hat. Richard Wetherill and his brothers, who later helped him excavate some of the Mesa Verde ruins, were cowboys, and she dressed as a cowboy to explore the same ruins. Catherine Lewis had Fred Jeep to themselves as a guide for about a week, and they also were able to meet archaeologist Jesse Walter Fuchs. Lewis sketched Mesa Verde Indian pots in a crude bound volume that she had picked up in Mancos. And it was when I was in the museum at Mesa Verde in May that I realized these weren't just modern Pueblo pots, that they are quite distinctly Mesa Verde pots that must have been excavated there. However, a large group of tourists arrived, and Jeep handed Catherine Lewis off to his nephew, who had just returned from 3 years of medical school in New England. James Rickner took Catherine Lewis to a recently discovered unexcavated ruin, leading them down from the rim of Chapin Mesa on what Lewis remembered as a very rough trail. We had in many places to hang from a tree or rock and then drop several feet to the next rock. They hiked south on the wide grassy bottom of Soda Canyon and then climbed up the opposite canyon wall to the ruin. Rickner had not brought the ropes needed to climb back up the wall of Chapin Mesa on the same trail they had descended, and so he led them further south down Soda Canyon and proposed they hike up Cliff Canyon on the other side of the mesa. So they'd gone down and were going to go back up to Fuchs Archaeological Camp. However, the floor of Cliff Canyon was just a mass of broken rocks all the way, and some of them as big as a house. So Cather told Rickner to go to the camp alone while she and Lewis waited for assistance. When the men from Fuchs Camp arrived, they still had strenuous climb up the rocky Cliff Canyon to the camp. They arrived at 2 a.m. The men hitched up a wagon and drove them back to the tent camp, and at 8 a.m., a team and driver took them back to Mancos. They weren't done with learning about Mesa Verde yet, however. Clayton Wetherill, who helped his brother Richard excavate the ruins, had recently arrived in Mancos for a visit, and so Catherine Lewis sought him out to hear the whole story of how Dick Wetherill swam the Mancos River on his horse and rode into the mesa after lost cattle, and how he came upon the cliff dwellings that had been hidden for centuries. From Mancos, Catherine Lewis journeyed to Taos, New Mexico, where they had friends, painters Ernest Blumenschein and Herbert Dunton, in the emerging artist colony. Both had produced illustrations for McClure's magazine while the women were on staff. Blumenschein, like most members of the Taos Society of Artists, painted southwestern landscapes and native peoples. That's the Rio Grande Gorge, which is outside of Taos, behind those two improbably Plains Indian war-bonneted Taos Pueblo Indians. But in any event, but Dunton painted animals, cowboys, as a rustler, and the occasional cowgirl. In Colorado, they had climbed and hiked and had been driven, but in New Mexico, they drove their own wagon and rode horseback. Cather had been to northern New Mexico before, but the landscape was new to Lewis. As she remembered, it was necessary to be on alert for every landmark. Otherwise, we were likely to lose our way on their long drives and rides through the countryside. In the same journal in which Lewis had sketched Indian pots in Mesa Verde, she drew idiosyncratic maps of their travels, including this one, which I'm still kind of obsessed with and trying to figure out. And there was a question yesterday, did women... Edith Lewis made maps, in which the geographical feature labeled the Black Mesa looms large. And there are half a dozen Black Mesas in New Mexico, and I kept going to the wrong ones in May. But I recently figured out, now I have to go back to really substantiate this, that it was Mesa Prieta, the dark Mesa. There's more than one Mesa Prieta. But in any event, it's clear that the one on this map, even though it's not quite geographically correct, is Mesa Prieta, a 10-mile-long basalt mesa covered with tens of thousands of petroglyphs, the highest concentration in New Mexico, documenting a long history of human habitation. In the immediate aftermath of their 1915 trip, Cather turned her attention away from the novel she described in August to the Denver Journalist. Blumenschein had annual painting trips to Taos subsidized by the Santa Fe Railway, which purchased his paintings to use in advertising. And Cather anticipated she might do the same, only with words. She boasted to her editor at Houghton Mifflin, Ferris Greenslet, that the general traffic manager of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had lent her the jewels of their corporate art collection, namely photographs of Mesa Verde and the Española Valley pueblos. "Do you want a book on the Southwest?" she queried, offering that she might induce the Santa Fe Railroad to furnish some transportation, enabling her to run about to some of the more distant places in Arizona the next summer and finish the whole thing off, giving the story of the Santa Fe Trail along with the rest. She boasted it would be the only reasonably good book on that country ever done. So Cather soon tried her hand at a portion of the travel book, writing an essay published in the Denver Times in January 1916 that promoted Mesa Verde as a wonderland with an easy reach for the tourist. Even though she promoted the national park as a commodity tourists might purchase, she burnished the Wetherell discovery of the ruins with a romantic glow, expressing envy of the entrada of Richard Wetherell into the canyon from which he first glimpsed the ruins. She portrayed the ruins as the highest achievement of Stone Age man, preserved in bright, dry sunshine like a fly in amber. This is actually very close to the language she would use in the professor's house. She made no mention of the subsequent excavation of the ruins and the ways the Wetherells profited from them. Edith Lewis also wrote about Mesa Verde for Every Week, placing it in the midst of other lost ancient cities. And her name is not on this anywhere, but clearly it had to be her. She had just been there. She wrote a long caption to accompany the photo of Cliff Palace. This is what the two cowboys hunting for stray cattle on Mesa Verde in Colorado accidentally stumbled on one day. A whole city with its walls and towers built up in the wall of the canyon, and that was how the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings came to be discovered, the oldest prehistoric ruins in America. The more enterprising of the two cowboys, whose name was Richard Wetherell, wasn't satisfied with discovering one city. He and a younger brother spent 5 winters on the mesa and discovered 20 or more cliff cities, to say nothing of a few cartloads of pottery and flint weapons, which they sold to scientific societies for upwards of $30,000. After that, the government got busy and decided to make government reserve of Mesa Verde. Rather than presenting the Cliff Palace as a high cultural achievement at which Richard Wetherell wonders, Lewis focuses on the cowboys' ambition and commercial acumen as he seeks out more ruins and profits from the sale of the excavation of artifacts. Cather's idea for a novel about the ruins returned. In Lewis's 1915 travel journal, Cather wrote a list of titles. We've got Youth's Adventure, A Young Adventure, The Blue Mesa, and The First Half, all heading in the direction of the theme and setting of what would become Tom Outland's story. And she and Lewis headed back to Taos in 1916. Cather wrote to Ferris Greenslet at the end of June 1916 from December that she was heading to the Pueblos and Black Mesa. Put another way, she was heading into the map that Lewis had drawn the year before. She pleaded with him not to let anyone else write a Southwestern travel book for him before she did. But she also observed that she was rather absorbed in another notion. You'll probably hear about it later. Catherine Lewis stayed in Taos for about 3 weeks. As she wrote her brother Douglas, she and Lewis could get excellent horses. Edith is a showy rider, and I can get at least manage to get about on a horse and don't much mind a rough trail. After this trip, Cather began referring in letters to the Blue Mesa. She wrote Ferris Greenslit that she was putting aside the travel book for a story of the Southwest, and the title will probably be The Blue Mesa, or something of that sort, and it will be full of love and hate. So Houghton Mifflin was increasingly publishing popular westerns at the time, and Greenslit was enthusiastic. The Blue Mesa full of love and hate sounds, as Mrs. Fields used to say, ripping. And he was keen, he said, to see it, and had put it down on their spring publication schedule and circled in red. And he was sure it would sell twice as many advance copies as The Song of the Lark. Indeed, The Blue Mesa Full of Love and Hate sounds like the title of a sensational Zane Grey Western. But Cather put it aside. Not until 1924 did she write The Professor's House, transforming the Blue Mesa into Tom Outland's story. In the spring of 1925, Cather and Lewis felt drawn to the Southwest again. As Cather wrote after the trip to her friend Harriet Witcher, a Mount Holyoke College English professor, she was hard at work in New Hampshire after a glorious summer riding horseback in New Mexico, sagebrush plains and aspen woods and high mountains. I wanted to go to Paris awfully in the spring, but somehow I wanted the sagebrush more. I have a regular Zane Grey mind. Roughneck and Lowbrow is the name for me. Indeed, Cather and Lewis had pursued cowboy adventure in 1925, but at the San Gabriel Ranch in Alcalde, New Mexico, they didn't have to choose between roughneck and culture, high culture. The ranch was owned and managed by Roy and Carol Pfeffley, a married couple who seemed to have walked out of the pages of The Virginian, in which the cowboy marries the genteel New England schoolmarm. Roy Pfeffley left Iowa after his father's death to support his mother and sister cowboying in New Mexico, while Massachusetts-born Carolyn Bishop Stanley studied piano at the New England Conservatory of Music and taught piano at a girls' boarding school. In 1916, at the end of a desert trek for which Roy was the guide and Carolyn a dude on vacation, they married. They managed dude ranches for others before acquiring an existing ranch near the confluence of the Rio Chama and the Rio Grande, midway between Taos and Santa Fe, and christened it the San Gabriel. The ranch combined gentility, including a Steinway grand piano in the main ranch house, with Western roughness. Wait a second, here we go. The ranch's 1925 brochure, and it's Roy Pfeffley wearing kind of the suit, and Jack Lambert, their primary cowboy, on the left, which was distributed by the Santa Fe Railway in its advertising campaigns, features photographs of high-hatted cowboys. Now, the ones I'm going to show you are sort of color slide versions because the black and white reproductions that are actually in the brochure aren't very good, but quite seriously, they're performing rope tricks, riding barrels, and gambling. This is what Willa Cather and Edith Lewis were buying in 1925, against a backdrop of single-story Pueblo-style buildings forming placitas, small courtyards. The brochure also boasted that within 15 miles of the ranch, guests could wander among the prehistoric ruins of the ancient Pueblo peoples on the famous Pajarito Plateau, with cliff dwellings and prehistoric ruins by the thousands. So those are what now is the Bandelier National Monument in the Puya cliff dwellings. As they had at Mesa Verde in 1915, Cather and Lewis handed the camera back and forth to take pictures of one another, including 2 photographs that mirror one another. The desert landscape is nearly featureless. Only dry grass and low sagebrush are visible. As in 1915, they wear their matching khaki suits, boots, and sturdy leather gloves covering their hands and wrists. Otherwise, they would have been burnt to a crisp by the sun. Cather sits her quiescent horse awkwardly, while Lewis sits erectly and stylishly on her more lively horse. She is that showy rider. In another photograph of Lewis, she and her horse have turned to the left, making visible her right hand holding a riding crop with which she controls her horse. Despite Cather's evocation of the Wetherell discovery of Mesa Verde ruins in Tom Outland's story, her fictional cowboys discover ruins in New Mexico, not Colorado. Cather and Lewis did not return to Mesa Verde to read the page proofs of the professor's house, but their surroundings at the San Gabriel Ranch evoked all of the key elements of Tom Outland's story. The northern New Mexico landscape, the cowboys and cattle dude ranches had to have cattle for income. and ancient cliff-dwelling ruins. At the San Gabriel Ranch, she and Lewis could sit outdoors in the cool morning to read page proofs of the professor's house, and after lunch, ride out from the ranch on good horses. Put another way, they could be author and editor in the morning and New Mexican Cowboys in the afternoon. At the end of the professor's house, Godfrey St. Peter finds himself facing the prospect of living a future without delight. But Godfrey's creator, Willa Cather, was about to embark on a delightful new adventure with her creative partner. Instead of playing cowboy, they would ride through the desert and mountains as two 19th century French priests assigned to the new diocese. But that's a story for another day. Thanks.
So now from Lady Cowboys to Cowgirls. I'm pleased to introduce Renée Laegreid, Professor of History in the U.S. West at the University of Wyoming. Her area of specialty is women and gender in the 20th century West, and her publications include Riding Pretty, Rodeo Royalty in the American West, 2006, an exploration of the emergence and development of the rodeo queen phenomenon from 1909 to 1969, and a co-edited volume of essays, Women on the North American Plains, that provides an overview of the diversity of women and their experiences in this region. She has published numerous essays on women in rodeo and is currently working on a book-length project that examines the media's role in shaping the contemporary image of the cowgirl. Laegreid is also series editor for Women, Gender, in the West, a book series published by Texas Tech University Press. Her talk today is Every Cowgirl Needs a Horse and a Gun and a Little Whiskey Too. A Little Whiskey Helps Too. Please welcome her.
Right to go forward. All right.
So thank you, everyone. I am really honored to be part of Caroline's symposium. Her remarkable collection of frontier women spans the chronological spectrum with examples of women exhibiting whatever agency and resources they had to make the best of situations that, if not of their choosing, were often not completely within their control. Following a husband or family from the old world to the new, setting up housekeeping, often more than once, on the edges of a wilderness, missionary wives interacting with Native Americans, and of course the always titillating captivity narratives. But when trying to figure out what to talk about today, because there are so many good topics to choose from, Lynne Farrington suggested I look at women's relationship with horses and guns, how they played a role in creating a sense of independence and self-sufficiency. And it was like, duh, cowgirls. So. The other right, okay. Joyce Roach Gibson wrote this wonderful quote: "The emancipation of women may have begun not with the vote, nor in the cities where women marched and carried signs and protested, but rather when they mounted a good cow horse and realized how different and fine the view from the back of a horse. The world would look wider." So I was about 10 years old when this picture was taken. Joyce Gibson wrote a full 10 years away from publishing this book for the first time, and I was about 30 years away from reading it. But sitting on top of my grandpa's horse, I knew the truth of those words. Even though my short pants didn't reach quite to the length they should have, and I was wearing black velveteen saddle shoes, sitting on top of that horse, I felt every inch a cowgirl. And women have had a sense of empowerment by identifying as a cowgirl since the late 19th century, when the word entered into the popular American lexicon, in a way that it hadn't with other types of frontier women. The reason, I argue, is that the independence and self-sufficiency and sense of pushing boundaries generally associated with cowgirls can be found by connecting two trends in late 19th century U.S. history: the popularization of Western cattle frontier through dime novels, Wild West shows, and performances in rodeo, and the emergence of the New Woman phenomenon. The convergence of these trends created a new role and a new role model for women that represented independence, self-sufficiency, but also daring that hadn't been seen before, and one that would expand beyond the region's borders in 19th century origins. This is one of my favorite images by Frederick Remington, and no, it is not a cowgirl. Although we associate cowgirls and cowboys with horses, this wasn't always the case. Prior to the rise of the cattle industry, girls and boys generally tended the family cows on foot. Slaves tended the master's cattle by taking them from the herd, taking the herd from the pen to the pasture and back again, as they had probably for centuries. Large-scale cattle ranches that emerged in the West after the Civil War demanded new strategies for managing thousands of head of cattle on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres, and huge amounts of land in Texas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, the Dakotas, open to stock growers when the United States government confined Great Plains Indians to reservations, and the elimination of bison herds, which was part of their strategy, created a void quickly filled by corporate ranchers and their domesticated cattle. The scale of the ranches required owners to rethink labor needs. Children on foot wouldn't work, and a workforce of hired men riding horses solved the problem of covering vast distances to check the cattle, for spring and fall roundups, and for the legendary cattle drives. This was a masculine world, physically hard, sometimes dangerous, out of doors, dealing with unpredictable weather and unpredictable animals, and the occasional bad guy. So the men hired as cowboys earned a reputation as low account, troublemaking ruffians associated with drinking and gambling and generally ungentlemanly-like conduct. Not that they were all bad, of course, but the idea that a cowboy is living on the edge, outside of middle-class norms and decorum, became an important part of the mystique, as it would for cowgirls. And during the 1870s to 80s, the reputation of cowboys began to improve. Mark Louse sums it up nicely, writing, quote, "Memory made the cowboy into a well-cultivated symbol of a rugged American past," unquote. Not just memory. Interest in frontier and Western adventures as Euro-Americans moved westward encouraged a growth in popular entertainment in the form of dime novels and Western shows. J. Randolph Cox credits dime novels for reconstructing cowboys' reality for readers, from hired hands working on a ranch to, quote, freelance figures moving from place to place in search of adventure, unquote. And of course, William F. Cody, or Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, first opened in May of 1883 in Omaha, Nebraska, and he launched a genre of outdoor entertainment that thrived for at least 30 years and off and on for another 30 more. Aside from the exciting roles cowboys played in his show, Cody had an essay that he incorporated into his programs. It was about 3 pages long, which really encouraged his viewers to consider cowboys for all the hard work they had done in bringing civilization to the West. That they're not that bad, folks. They helped us with Manifest Destiny. And with the publication of Owen Wister's The Virginian in 1902, the transformation of the cowboy was fairly well complete. They had become the well-armed enforcers of virtuous conduct, justice, and fair play. Finally, a cowgirl, right? This image of a rancher's daughter, taken by Solomon Butcher in Nebraska's Panhandle in the late 1880s, brings together a constellation of visuals associated with cowgirls. First, of course, is the wide open spaces. Unlike Cather's Land in south central Nebraska, the sandhills of northwestern Nebraska are rangeland. It's arid and not suitable for the type of farming that happens down further south. Second, of course, is a horse. And I like to think there's a flask of whiskey tied to the saddle for, snake bite or just in case. And third is gun, and I'll go more into guns later. And next is the word itself, which according to the OED first appeared in print in 1884. OED identifies Nebraska as one of the two places where this word originates, and gives us a fairly interesting and concise description. A cowgirl owns some stock, which she personally looks after. So a cowgirl is no one who no longer just tends the family. She is an owner in a business. And lastly, during the 1880s, the new woman phenomenon emerged, characterized by young middle-class women pushing back against traditional gendered boundaries, insisting on having the freedoms, adventures, and even careers that had been the exclusive prerogative of men. And, of course, the emergence of the new woman led to a contest between traditionalists and modernists over the role of women in society, of which cowgirls would become a part. Now, simple as this image may appear, the emergence of the cowgirl is wonderfully complicated because the term includes both traditional and modern or new women. Wives and daughters who helped out on family ranchers and who worked outside the domestic sphere may or may not have considered themselves new women. Most, like this ranch daughter, Sadie Austin, did not. They learned to help with ranch chores at a very early age, acquiring the skills and taking on responsibilities necessary for the success of their family's ranch. These cowgirls, like the Cowboys, rode their horses across great distances, fixed fence, cared for cattle, dealt with bad weather, and were ready to handle any number of unexpected situations, hence the rifle. In her book, Old Jewels, Mari Sandoz, another Nebraska writer, talks about her father, a Swiss immigrant who settled in the Sandhills in the late 1890s, and of her family's life there. In one part, she describes being sent out to find the family's cattle after a 3-day blizzard. Cattle tend to move with the storm, tails to the wind, which is fine until they run up against a fence, and then they tend to pile up and can starve or freeze to death. So out she went, and after a hard day's riding and the disappointment of only being able to save a few of their cows, she stumbled back into the house, tired, cold, and now snowblind in one eye. It's hardly a glamorous adventure, edgy or daring. Most ranch cowgirls, once married, hung up their spurs and turned their attention to a more traditional role as wife or mother. Rather than the story of frontier feminism, 19th century cowgirls, like Sandoz and Austin, lived a pragmatic expediency. And I find Doreen Massey's framework of place, space, and gender particularly useful for understanding how traditional women did untraditional work within a culture that accepted it as normal. If you're not familiar with Massey, she defines place as an alignment of geographic location with ideas and values brought into that area by settlers. Space is a varied social relationships that emerged in a particular place during a very specific time. And the gender relationships are the formations unique to a specific place and space. In short, place, space, and gender provides a rationale for the situational reality that allowed ranch women to do what seemed unconventional to outsiders, but business as normal to those who lived in the area. Sandoz, like many other ranch women, rode horses and dealt with cattle because the family relied on their help, and like so many other ranch daughters, left the family ranch and the cowgirl life once married. So how did the reality of ranch women's lives evolve into the idea of a cowgirl as independent and edgy, boundary pushing and daring, like this one? And I suppose you're wondering, what the heck's going on here? I don't know either. And if you look really close at this horse's eyes, he's going like, I don't know what's happening either, but I'm not getting up. So I'd like to go back to the topic of the guns for a minute, because that helps provide an entree into the distinction between traditional cowgirls whose experiences were normalized by place, space, and gender on the family ranch, to the construction of edgy, daring, independent, can-do cowgirls, which evolved in tandem with the popularization of the West and the new woman. Let's talk about guns for a minute, because all cowgirls could shoot, right? Yes, they can. In the late 1870s, as some women began to push the boundaries for experiences outside the home, Sharpshooting became popular in the East amongst middle-class women. And the popularity of the sport led to a growing acceptance of women shooting guns. In her book, Her Best Shot, Women and Guns in America, Laura Browder notes that women taking up guns was a significant break from tradition. The armed woman has held and continues to hold enormous symbolic significance in American culture. Throughout most of American history, the gun has served as a recurrent symbol that links violence and masculinity. Dime novels and later Wild West shows turned shooting guns from genteel pastimes into something exciting, adventurous, daring, and it has solidified the link to Western women. I love this image of Calamity Jane. It was just in I think the latest issue of Montana, the magazine of the West. I'd never seen that one before, and there she is drinking beer with one of the Wyoming Cowboys. So Calamity Jane first appeared as a dime novel character in 1877, the same year as another one of Edward L. Wheeler's characters, Hurricane Nell. Sandra Wilson Smith writes that Wheeler created a new female hero, an outlaw with a heart of gold. The Calamity Jane character was very loosely based on the real life of Martha Canary, but made acceptable for middle-class audiences, a woman tough enough to survive the frontier wilderness, who appropriates masculine skills and powers. She's an outlaw, fast with her gun, but only to protect innocent people. She's tough, courageous, one of the boys, and she wears pants, the piece of clothing symbolically associated with male power. But her female masculinity is mitigated by her feminine beauty, according to the dime novel. And the text describes her long, luxuriant tresses, her full red lips, creamy white hands, and curvaceous figure. And I'd just like to go back to this for a minute to show how loosely based the dime novel really is on the true figure. But she's not a traditional woman. Her combination of masculine skill and feminine appearance, at least in the dime novel, is a precursor to the modern cowgirl. Annie Oakley rose to international fame as a sharpshooter through public performance. A counter to Calamity Jane's unconventional image, Oakley cultivated a very traditional one. Going back to Browder, she notes that while shooting was associated with violence and masculinity, women have escaped conventional gender roles by picking up guns, and in doing so, they become armed icons. Paradoxically, to succeed with the public, those famed armed women had to embrace female stereotypes and expectations. Calamity Jane character had nodded to female stereotypes. Oakley embraced them. She rode horses, side saddle, not astride. She wore modest skirts, which she embroidered herself, but they were full skirts, not split skirts. She wore a cowgirl hat and Western gloves, and of course she could shoot. And the crowds loved her because she could shoot better than men while looking and acting like a perfectly traditional woman. She had a glamorous career, and performing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, she was marketed as a Western woman who could balance a professional career linked to violence and masculinity with feminine dress and demeanor. Although Wild West shows and dime novels, or along with Wild West shows and dime novels, rodeo played an important role in popularizing and glamorizing cowgirls. As I mentioned earlier, the OED noted the first written reference of cowgirl was published in 1884, but the word doesn't become part of the mainstream and vernacular for about another 15 years. When it does, it's connected to a rodeo performer. Will Rogers is credited with using the term in 1899 when he visited St. Louis and saw 14-year-old Lucille Mulhall in her first public riding and roping contest. He considered her performance there to be the direct start as what has since come to be known as the cowgirl. A few years later, President Theodore Roosevelt saw Mulhall performing at a roping exhibition in Oklahoma City. When he referred to her as a cowgirl, reporters covering the president quoted him, newspapers published his comments, and cowgirl sprung full force into the American vernacular. Ranchers, of course, had been using this word for some time, but now Americans across the country were introduced to the term through women's performances and rodeo events based on the work associated with cowboys. At the turn of the 19th century, Mulhall enjoyed the title First American Cowgirl. The emergence of mass spectator events provided a venue for Mulhall's talents, as they did for Annie Oakley and other Wild West performers. But coinciding shifts in social and cultural attitudes made it possible for women to pursue those talents as careers. Between 1880 and 1929, the topic of women and their role in society became part of the national debate. Modernists, who advocated for gender reform, challenged the Victorian-era limitations on activities considered proper for women, and helped open the door for women like Mulhall, Oakley, and others to embark on careers outside the home. Modernists encouraged young middle-class women to move outside the domestic sphere, to seek out social, economic, and professional opportunities that had been closed to them solely on the basis of their sex. Traditionalists, on the other hand, argued the necessity for women to adhere to the virtues of true womanhood: piety, purity, submission, domesticity. They stressed the importance of women staying within the confines of the home in order to focus on family and domestic responsibilities. What would happen to society, they asked, if women should leave the protected sphere and enter the nasty, competitive world of work and politics? It would end completely. The debate over the role of women created a spirited controversy on its own, but combined with the popularity of Sigmund Freud's recently published work that acknowledged women's sexuality and the introduction of the birth control movement that made expressing sexuality easier and safer, civilization itself seems to hinge on whether or not women maintain gender separation, domestic roles, and passive behaviors or not. And rodeo cowgirls emerged during this era of the new woman, and the women who chose to carve out a career on the rodeo circuit found themselves in the middle of this controversy. Ranch wives and daughters like Austin and Sandoz, who used their skills at home, stayed out of the fray. Even young ranch women who competed in their local rodeos distanced themselves from professional cowgirls. Ella Granger was reared on the ranch outside of Pendleton, Oregon. She competed in the Pendleton Roundup during the early 1900s. She recalled that the professional cowgirls, quote, would play cards and drink and associate with men all the way around more so than we did. We didn't know that kind of life, unquote. When asked if the cowgirl athletes were proper women, she whispered, "I don't think so." Women who opted to perform as cowgirl athletes, who, as Paula Fass writes, self-consciously cross boundaries to develop traditional behaviors, self-consciously cross boundaries of traditional behavior to express sexuality, individualism, and self-development, unquote, became part of the national concern over women. To traditionalists, these new women of the West seem to have abandoned the obligation of their sex to uphold moral standards. To modernists, they offered a whole new role model. Cowgirls participating in arguably the most masculine of sports had to overcome cultural biases in order to gain favorable public image. One bias centered on the association of public performance and immorality. Women who had taken to the stage or any other type of public performance faced the prospect of a rather tawdry reputation. Another bias concerned the fear that if women participated in masculine activities, they would lose their feminine attributes and become mannish. Cowgirl performers countered these biases, as had Oakley and other Wild West performers, with purposely feminine behavior and costumes, appearing as the epitome of femininity while riding broncs or roping calves. Their costumes, although inspired by practical cowboy attire, produced a new concept of what it meant to be feminine. The cowgirls adorned their skirts with colorful embroidery, wore silk blouses, colorful scarves, and exquisitely tooled boots. And Prairie Rose Henderson, who is on the far left here, is one of the most colorful of the performers. She had mink-lined bloomers, and all sorts of just fabulous costumes that allowed her to really show that she was quite womanly, even though she's out there roping steers and riding broncs. And Fox Hastings was a bulldogger, and I don't know if you're familiar with rodeo. Do you know what bulldogging is? It's so much fun. I've never done it, but I like to watch it. Someone rides next to a steer, and then there's someone who rides next to it, and you jump off your horse and you grab the steer by the horns and you turn it upside down. That's called bulldogging, which is terribly difficult and dangerous. And Fox Hastings was very good at it, and she was considered completely mannish. And again, to try to overcome that label, she would talk to reporters about how she liked to do embroidery for her little nieces and how she liked to cook meals, and she really was quite a womanly woman. So dime novels and Wild West shows and rodeo elevated the work of ranch cowgirls into the popular mainstream and the popular imagination, as media had done for the Cowboys. But unlike the Cowboys, the popularized version of cowgirl played into the tug-of-war between traditionalists and modernists over the role of women in society, shaping public image of what a cowgirl was or could be. They were free to roam out of the domestic sphere, free to look for adventure, free to ride her horse. And she was safe from threats because she had her trusty gun. She was self-reliant, self-sufficient, able to handle a man's job, from shooting a gun to roping steers, but all the while looking like a lady, or at least not becoming too mannish. And I'll conclude now by returning to Joyce Gibbons Roach. She defined a cowgirl as a female whose life is or was for a significant part influenced by cattle, horses, and men who dealt with either or both, often as dominant figures, but not always, which is really complicated. Because not all women who lived in the West were cowgirls, not all cowgirls identified as new women. But the West, with its open spaces and its role within the media, beckoned with all sorts of opportunities. And the idea of the cowgirl, based in reality, but popularized by literature and performance, became a role model for women and girls of all ages, no matter where they lived, to challenge traditions, to challenge themselves. And it still does. Thank you.
Thanks. I was curious if I could ask each of you if in Cather's youth, Edith Lewis's youth, if they rode horses, raised horses, trained horses, had relationships with horses as young girls, and also from the cowgirl standpoint, I have family who grew up in the country, who raised horses, and the girls especially were good at training horses and were paid to train other people's horses. So I wondered if that was a business that went on.
I would say for Willa Cather spent a year of her childhood out in the countryside on a ranch before her family moved into Red Cloud, into town. And she, talked a lot and made comments about riding her pony around the countryside. Edith Lewis grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, the state capital. I know from government records that her family kept some horses and pigs and cows and chickens in the city of Lincoln. But I really wish I knew more about her experience. I mean, I think it is clear. I have a friend who was a competitive horsewoman and is an adolescent who's helped me look at those photographs. And she's like, Edith Lewis knows how to ride. Willa Cather has no idea what she's doing. But I really have no idea where that skill and knowledge came from and how she kept up her skills living in New York from 1903. But I wish I knew. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that she could have, used the horses in Central Park. I don't know. I mean, I have a fantasy that perhaps she rode out of the Central Park stables, but I really have no idea whether that's true.
Completely possible.
It's possible, but...
Yeah. And about women who train horses, was that?
Right. That was a frequent occupation.
I wouldn't say it was a frequent occupation. When you get into the women who started to become rodeo or cowgirl athletes, the performers, then you do see a lot of women training their own horses because, there were trick riders, exhibition trick riders, and they're also relay riders, so they're training their horses for the relay races. So yeah, for them it was important to be able to train their own horses, but they were professional career riders. And that's a distinction between the girls who like to dress up and be cowgirls. And what I find so really interesting about this topic is that it is complicated. You had women who worked on ranches who would never have considered themselves a career woman. They're just doing what you need to do. And then somehow it springboards into the public imagination. And this is also in combination with, I guess, later on in the 20s with the rise of dude ranches. People who want to consider themselves a cowgirl, even though they really don't have ranch experience, but they like the idea of the freedom. And I don't want to take up too much time, but you're also, I see this translate into popular music with songs about cowgirls. Patsy Montana's songs about I want to be a cowboy sweetheart, and other songs about women, written by women who have come from the East, who have never really been outside in the West, but have this image of what it means to be free and independent. And then the West and being a girl on a horse would provide that freedom.
Thank you both. These were really fun presentations. And I'm trying to formulate a question, kind of springboarding off what you were just saying, Renee, and what came up in both of the presentations. It's so interesting that in some ways these women, some of your cowgirls, and definitely Catherine, her friend, are these new women, modern women, and yet they eschew the car, right? And you said in New Mexico they definitely avoid the automobile and they ride instead. And it seems, and one of the themes we've been seeing is this ability for women to move freely, and yet in these cases they're choosing horses, which is this older transportation. And it's, how do you see it working with then their efforts to be very modern women? I think it's fascinating.
So Catherine Lewis in 1925, after they're at the San Gabriel Ranch, Mabel Lujan and Tony Lujan come to pick them up. They're very persistent about this invitation. They come grab them, and then Willa Cather and Edith Lewis are driven all over around Taos by Tony Lujan for 2 weeks, although they also ride out into the foothills. So they later, and at this point, Cather is 10 years older than Lewis. I think it becomes harder for her, and so they consent to be driven, but neither learns to drive. There is sort of that moment of transition when they sort of allow, and then in 1926, Willa Cather's brother Roscoe comes down from Wyoming, and he's got the family car, and they drive around like they're driven. So, but there is that sense that they really do. Cather still complains about cars all the time, that you don't want to be in the car, that thank God there was no car, because, you want the slow experience. So she is going for, so she is a new woman, but she's also, and sometimes classified as a modernist, but she is also in many respects an anti-modernist. And she rejects, so she goes back and forth in the way that I think we all do. So,
And I think the ability to get on a horse, you're not constrained by a road. You can go where you want. You are a partner with your horse. And if you want to go there, you go there. But you're also not, with the images of the cowgirls that you see, especially in popular magazines, they're usually by themselves, which is also empowering.
Yes, this is on. The question of women wearing pants, which is, of course, germane if you're going to ride a horse. But at the same time, in the 1880s, the bicycle came in. And it's very difficult to ride a bicycle in a skirt. So is there a correlation between the modern woman who rides a bicycle and the cowgirl?
Well, there's a correlation. Both activities, riding astride and riding a bicycle, are both thought to be too sexually stimulating for women. Yes. So that's part of it. But there is the divided skirt. And Willa Cather and Edith Lewis don't go the divided skirt route. And I've seen a lot of pictures by like Natalie Curtis Berlin, who lived in Santa Fe. She's wearing a divided skirt to ride a horse, right? So so there was a sort of intermediate route.
Yeah, and one image that I didn't put up here was of a ranch girl. She's being photographed by Solomon Butcher, and she's discreetly holding up the corner of her skirt to show that she has divided skirt underneath it, So again, there's this this cultural imperative that real women wear skirts, and it's these dangerous new women that are wearing divided skirts or bloomers. But this, in the 1880s, this is just following into the dress reform movement, trying to get women out of corsets, trying to get them into more healthy style of garment that's going to allow for more freedom of movement for bicycles or horses or whatever else they're doing.
I just had a quick comment. Thank you so much. I just wanted to let you know that we have a substantial part of the Wetherell collection a few blocks away at the Penn Museum. And some of those ceramics are actually on display now, a few of them. So.
Oh, so some of the ones that they made some money selling, yes.
That's right.
Last question up here, I think.
Did the ranch girls give up the outdoor life when they married because they were relieved to give up the onerous men's work, or because of social pressure?
Both. There are some women that continue to do some ranch work. There's the Binfords down in West Texas that I've studied quite a bit. It was an amazing transition from, a married woman who became a ranch wife and took up all the activities that her husband did, and then continued to do that after she had children, and she taught her daughters to be ranch, very active cowgirls. To others who just said, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And again, in a more traditionalist manner, they found satisfaction being the wives and mothers. And this is where I find that contest between modernists and traditionalists being played out in the ranches in the West is so fascinating. Who decided to take a more modern route? Who wanted to have a career, out with horses and ranches, maybe training horses, and who wanted to retreat back into the home because that's where they found satisfaction.
Can I just throw one other thing into the mix? As the oldest of 5 girls, they kept trying for a boy. Fortunately for the little critter, he didn't arrive. He probably would have been distraught and so forth from birth. But how about families that only had girls? I mean, talking to everybody, how did that confuse and annoy the male role model and the female role model? That's just a comment, not a question, but you can answer.
For some of the ranch families that had just girls, or had girls and boys, often it would be the father that would encourage the girls to go out and help with ranch chores. And there's an example of one mother who was quite distraught that her husband told the daughter to wear pants. It was too dangerous to wear skirts. And the mother was like, absolutely not. She cannot wear pants. And so there was, the shuffle where the girl would put on the pants in the barn and then take off the pants before going back into the house.
Okay, I think we'll thank our speakers.